So recently I was working on a very interesting project where I needed to get all of the airports from a certain location, specifically from Papua New Guinea. So what's interesting is that you can use OpenStreetMap data for this. However, as we can see right here on the screen, trying to get an entire country's worth of map data, even for something as relatively rare as an airport, it's actually really difficult and there's too much data. It's too large to export. So we needed a different approach to be able to pull all of the airport data out of this country. And ideally, we would do it in such a way that we can easily replicate this for other countries when necessary. After looking over the various options, it looks like there are a ton of different ways that you can actually pull out this data. You can use the Overpass API, Planet OSM, and a few other things as well. Now, Planet OSM are complete copies of the OpenStreetMap database. It is 141 gigabytes compressed, which expands out to be something like 1,900 gigabytes after you unzip it. So that was not something I was interested in digging through. So the next best solution was using the API, which I'm pretty familiar with APIs. APIs are normally the way to go when you're trying to extract some data from existing data sets. So I just wanted to make this quick video to kind of show how I did this with the Overpass API, because it's not very intuitive as to how you're supposed to do this. So the first thing that I did was I found this wiki page about using the Overpass API. And of course, I skipped past the interactive UI and I went straight to for developers and programmers, because I am a developer and sometimes I'm a programmer. I love this because immediately I recognized this was some JavaScript and it would let me put in some data and it would let me get out some JSON, which is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be able to extract this. I went down this path and I actually could not figure out how to get my bounding box to be the bounding box that I needed for Papua New Guinea. So what's interesting is I actually ended up going to the UI, which is, yeah, that's the same UI. So I ended up going to the UI. And what's interesting here is that they actually have a custom query language. You can see this is not anything, it doesn't, it's not very intuitive what this query language is. It's completely custom. But what's really interesting is that Claude, or presumably ChatGPT, can actually help you with this. So I used Claude and I asked it to write me an Overpass API query that gets all the airports in Papua New Guinea. And it found a couple of interesting hacks here. And I had to prompt it to get me all of the airports because the first iteration only got me one airport. So it did a couple of interesting things here. I actually haven't taken the time to understand what these .ping queries are. But what's interesting is that you can give it an ISO 3166 country code, and then you can query for certain nodes and relations. So here I'm assuming PG is Papua New Guinea. And then I asked for arrowways, the nodes ways, which I'm assuming are anything that are connected, and then relations, which is any feature I'm assuming that's related to an arrowway node. And what's interesting is if you run this, there you go. You get all of the airports specifically within Papua New Guinea, which is actually pretty freaking rad. If you click on any one of these, you can see what it is, whether it's a way or an arrow. I don't know the difference between an arrowway and an airport is, but presumably those are the same. I'm not doing the actual data collation on this project. I just needed to help get us a solution that would get the airports properly queried. And then presumably we could just swap out PG with any other. This probably won't work because it's going to call the United States, which probably has an insane number of airports. There's almost no way this works. If it does, it might take absolutely forever. Been sitting here for a little over 45 seconds now. Been sitting here for over a minute and a half now. The United States has a lot of airport data. All right, well, there you have it. The query timed out in query at line 6 after 181 seconds. So yeah, I can't query all the airport data from the United States. At least not using this UI. You can't. Anyway, back to our regularly scheduled programming here. Once you get the visual representation and you're relatively certain this is the data that you want, you can click export and you get a number of different formats. I've worked with GeoJSON personally in the past, especially if you're using something like CZM.js. This is a very useful data format, but you can also use it with something like KML if you're using some ArcGIS formatting. So you can also export the query itself, and you can also export as a ping or an interactive map in case you wanted to re-embed that data somewhere else. So I hope that was useful. This is probably a bit of a strange, obscure part of the web that most people are not interacting with on their day-to-day lives. But if you ever have to work with GIS data, you're probably aware that you can run into some really interesting edge cases where the amounts of data that you have to sort through are just absolutely massive. So understanding how to use an API to be able to precisely query down to the data that you need can be super, super useful. And a lot of times, especially like in this situation right here, you may not even know what the query language format is that you're trying to use. In such cases, it's really, really helpful to have models such as Claude or ChatGPT, which can help write the query language for you. You can put in plain language, hey, this is what I need to find using this specific query language, and it can give you the results that work perfectly the first time. Now, after coming up with the solution, I realized that the body of this JavaScript fetch method here is just the query that we had Claude build for us, and then we put into the UI. So coming back to this second time, I realized that I can just replace everything inside this body with my query right here, and I will get in JSON results the exact query that we got right here. Now, one of the things that I'm not 100% sure on is how I might be able to change the export format. I'm sure I could pass something into that post query in order to get that. To be quite frank, I didn't end up really needing that. So I'm sure that there is a way to change the export format that the JSON results are returned in. But if you need something as simple as KML or GeoJSON, I'm sure that there's a way to do that here. At the end of the day, the UI ended up being fairly intuitive and actually kind of nice because I can manually review that my query got all the things that I expected it to get. Though just being able to programmatically swap out the country code and run it through a asynchronous query might actually be really nice in the future, because we might have some sort of cron job or something like that that we use to keep this airport data up to date. So in the future, this might become necessary, but I just thought it was kind of funny that it ended up being much more useful to use the UI first, and then later the programmatic approach became a little bit more obvious. And I just think it's funny. It's classic programmer hubris on my part that, I'd just be able to jump straight into the API when the UI was actually extremely easy to use and helped me understand the problem domain a little bit better. Anyways, I hope this is useful for somebody else out there who is trying to use the Overpass API and maybe is a little bit stumped.